War was everywhere. As America and Central Europe were tearing at each other's throats, Russia was next, after announcing their ambitions earlier. The war declaration on Alash Orda became official as blood would flow here as well. Socialist Republic of Italy, that dominated against the factions to the south, unsurprisingly, had little trouble with their enemies to the north to secure a full autonomy. Benito Mussolini now could enjoy some peace and quiet, though the knives were sharpened at the borders. He instated commissars with the purpose of spreading his influence and ideology to gain stability across the entire country that had been divided up in many different factions for the last decades. Then some good news for Washington's hope arrived for the first in a long time. Federal forces had been pushing towards the American Union State's temporary capital of Atlanta for a while. Reports were coming in of the city's imminent capture by advancing US troops. Huey Long's current whereabouts were unknown, but it was believed he was rapidly evacuated to the countryside. Reports indicated that military police had begun rounding up Union representatives and Minutemen en masse, and that fires were now spreading unchecked through the city as the Federal Army was focused on restoring order. The US soldiers were able to cut off a chunk of landmass held by the Union state, but though it was ripe for the taking, they lacked the amount of troops to hold such an increased size of territory this quickly. Alash Orda stood no chance to the might of Russia, showcasing to the world that all doubt in their powers was for naught. Though there were many wars on the different continents, the one war that was often forgotten about was the one between the Pacific states and Mexico. With each passing week, Mexico crept closer to the north. Then a year after the Civil War had begun, Canada's bureaucratic steps towards assembling a pact with the USA had been completed and could now be set in motion within the next 2 months. A treaty of non-aggression, military access, and exclusive trading rights were on the agenda. If the pact was accepted by Washington, it still meant Canada was not part of the conflict, but then it would only be a matter of days before that could occur. The Austrian-Hungarian War had ended in a white peace, with each faction retaining territory while keeping each other in check with mistrusting eyes. The resurgence of the Mongols, announced earlier with the rise of the power of Ungern Khan, continued as they declared war on Tibet, their ally during the war against Maklik. In Canada, about 1,000 volunteers were on their way towards Washington the moment it was announced that a treaty with Washington was in progress. They would not attack the opposing factions, but merely relieve and resupply the US troops in the capital and preventing it from falling into enemy hands. Though the US troops did try to take the cut-off area from the Union state, as expected, they did not have enough men to hold the line, and a few hundred troops got separated and mowed down in an act of vengeance for the fall of Atlanta. A second army, between 30 and 40,000 strong, came under the command of General Alan Brooke. They were sent all across the wide border to the south opposite of the American syndicalists. With Russia dominating in their first conflict, their next conflict would also not prove any difficulty, as Russia's foreboding wrath could be felt throughout the West. The Ottoman Empire, part of a theater not in the spotlights of Canadian intelligence due to lack of technology, had announced publicly to the world that it got into a war with the Sultanate of Egypt. With negotiations being underway between Canada and Washington, intelligence on the US troops' position and the situation of the war came to light as well, proving how dire things were. The 1,000 troops arrived in Washington, bringing ammunition and weapons, but more importantly, food, smokes, and friendly human contact from the outside. Many US troops could finally sleep a bit better knowing that the Canadian and British volunteers had their backs. 2 more factions got involved in the war regarding the Ottoman Empire, threatening conflicts to spark all the way down Africa. A cluster of smaller factions got entangled, biting off more than they could chew, though the Ottomans were facing multiple enemies all at the same time neighboring their border. Fighting in America was fierce. The syndicalists tried their best day in and day out to breach through to the capital to make the remaining US fall. The horrors of the war were written and sent to loving wives and worried mothers by the soldiers stationed in the capital. And then the German Empire finally got into a war as well, as they headed into Belgium to the west. After the end of the Weltkrieg, with the signing of the Peace of Honor, and even more so, after the Revolution in 1925, Britain and Portugal had drifted further and further apart despite remaining in a formal alliance. But as dangerous times began to threaten Europe and the time to reclaim the birthright was fast approaching, Portugal asked the king for support and would in turn provide support during the fast approaching Second Weltkrieg. And with that, Portugal had joined the Entente. The Dominion of India got war declared by Nepal that had set its borders in stone, expecting to make a ruckus with this reckless move. India assured the king that no reinforcements would be necessary. The Ottoman Empire was being devoured rapidly as multiple nations threw themselves onto them without mercy or remorse. Though Nepal in the initial days of the war was able to leash out and win some territory for their gain, it became clear that it would slow down rapidly and turn against their favor soon. As Russia was still involved in a war to the west, their victory over Alash Orda motivated troops to keep heading south, and eventually they declared war on Turkestan as well. Then on the 21st of January 1938, the negotiations and conclusion sealing the pact with the United States had finally rounded up. The United States had officially ratified the Pact of Non-Aggression and Cooperation. All trade with the rebellious Union State and combined syndicates had been cut off. The next step would be important, because this would finally embed Canada, and therefore the Entente intervening and getting involved in the war. However, this would still take more than 80 days to realize. With rumors spreading throughout the country of Canada's involvement, both the Union State and the CSA double-timed on their efforts to overthrow the remaining US soldiers. The Germans in Central Europe were heading into Belgium. Casualties were high, due to their overwhelming number being neglected due to the narrow borderline. The Ottoman Empire struck back at its enemies via air invasions and flanking maneuvers to create chaos from within. With Canada making preparations to get involved with the war, the 1,000 troops in Washington headed out to meet the syndicalists head-on to slow down their approach. They were not enough to make a difference, but could stall them at various locations. Then halfway through February, the Iron Guard stood victorious over the Romanian monarch. Coldrenu had quite a task ahead of him of repairing the damage that arose from the Civil War. His factory effort was the first step of creating some harmony in a devastated country again. With the CSA attack from the north successfully stalled, the Canadian volunteers now headed west as a ferocious assault by the syndicalists had put them closer to the borders of Washington. Serbia, Romania, and Greece, the three Balkan members of the Entente, each with views of their own, had recently gathered to a common table of negotiations and had announced the beginning of the Belgrade Pact. While this pact would put a lot of focus on cultural discussion and preserving the Balkan identities, it was also a military alliance between the participants, seemingly directed at the countries separating them and holding their ancestral lands. This development was a big thorn in Bulgarian domination of the Balkans. In the first week of March, German forces had moved all the way to the coast, now having surrounded the few remaining Belgian troops who opposed. The Mongolian attack on Tibet bared fruit as they achieved an easy victory and had turned into one of the most powerful nations in Asia. Their neighboring Russia had achieved a victory as well, gaining excessive land to their gain, which in their eyes was theirs by right to begin with. The civil war in Spain still continued, and though shifting every other week, still remained fairly even for all three factions. In America, the syndicalists were coming from everywhere, but were just not able to breach through, though the US defenses were on the verge of giving in. It would take less than 30 days for a war declaration to be prepared, and an addition of the Entente could be disastrous for the CSA. Though Canada had one flaw, which was their wide front line that they could not protect at all places. It was their own Achilles heel, but Canada hoped for troops to arrive from other Entente countries to come to their aid. Soon blood would flow across the entire Canadian border.